There's a moment when a room goes quiet in a way that has nothing to do with noise. Not the polite kind of quiet when someone taps a glass and asks for attention. The other kind. The kind where everyone in the room suddenly realizes the story they've been carrying around in their heads is wrong, and they don't quite know where to set it down. I was 63 years old the night that happened to me, and I was sitting at my own son's retirement party, not my retirement, his at a long table in a private room at a steakhouse in Knoxville, Tennessee, surrounded by people I'd known for 20 years, when my daughter-in-law stood up, raised her glass, and said the thing that split my life neatly into before and after. Her name is Renata. She's 38, sharp as a finishing nail, and she'd never once pretended to think much of me. Which I'd always respected, actually. I'd rather know where I stand than wonder. She smiled at the table, unhurried, the way someone smiles when they've already decided the conversation is won. "I want to toast my husband," she said. "A man who pulled himself up with zero help from anyone." A pause, the practice kind. Especially not from the man sitting right there. She nodded toward me. A few people laughed. Not cruel laughter, more the uncomfortable kind, where nobody's quite sure if it's a joke or a knife. My son, David, was already staring at his plate. "Raymond here," she said, "has been living off David's goodwill since David was 22 years old. And I think it's time we all just said it." The table went still. "My name is Raymond Tully. I'm 63 years old. I spent 31 years running a small engine repair and fabrication shop in Maryville, Tennessee, the kind of place that fixes what other people throw away and builds what other people say can't be built. I've got 2 bad wrists from 20 years of wrenches, a scar on my left forearm from a lathe that didn't forgive me for being careless one morning in 2003, and a filing cabinet in my back office with more financial records than most people see in a lifetime. I am not, and have never been, anyone's burden. But standing there in that room, looking at 30 faces looking back at me, I understood something Renata didn't. She believed it. Every word. She wasn't performing. She was reporting. And that is a completely different problem. I want to stop here for a second and talk to you, friend. If you've ever sat at a table while someone rewrote you out loud, while they told a room exactly who you are, using a version of you that you've never even met, then you already understand what I felt sitting there. It's a specific kind of cold. Not anger, not yet. Something quieter. The feeling of watching your own house burn from the wrong side of a locked fence. I kept my hands flat on the table. David finally looked up. His face was the color of old paste. He opened his mouth, and Renata put a hand on his arm, light as a feather, and he closed it again. That hand was its own message. At the far end of the table, a man named Gerald Foss set down his fork. Gerald is 67, a retired electrician, and has been my closest friend since we were 19 years old, sweating through the same apprenticeship program in a warehouse that smelled like burnt copper and bad coffee. He looked at me, then at Renata, then back at me. He didn't say anything, but the way his jaw settled told me everything I needed to know. Gerald was carrying something, and whatever it was heavy. The rest of the dinner finished the way dinners do when something's been broken, and nobody wants to be the one to pick up the pieces. People talked around it. Forks moved. Someone gave a proper toast. David made a short speech about his career that was gracious and didn't mention me once, which was its own answer to a question I hadn't asked yet. I drove home alone on 411 North, the radio off, the headlights cutting through fog that had settled low over the valley the way it does in October. I wasn't thinking about Renata. I was thinking about Gerald. He'd driven 4 hours from Greenville to be at that dinner, and he'd barely said 10 words, and the look on his face when Renata spoke wasn't shock. It was the look of a man who has heard something before and is tired of hearing it. My phone was dark on the seat beside me the whole drive home. No text from David. Nothing. I made coffee I didn't need, sat down at the kitchen table with the one lamp on, and stared at the wall until almost midnight. Then Gerald called. "You still up?" "Yeah." He was quiet for a moment. "I need to show you something." Not on the phone. "You free tomorrow morning?" I told him I was. "There's a diner over in Friendsville. Parker's, you know it?" I knew it. The kind of place with laminated menus and a pie case by the register and booths that have held 1,000 difficult conversations. 8 o'clock, he said. "And Raymond," a pause, "don't call David tonight. I didn't sleep much. Parker's was warm and loud with the breakfast crowd when I got there. Gerald was already in a corner booth, 2 coffees waiting, a folded piece of paper in front of him he wasn't touching. He looked like a man who'd been up since 5 deciding how to start a sentence. I sat down. I didn't say anything. Gerald's always been the kind of person who gets to the point when he's ready and not a second before. He wrapped both hands around his mug. How long has Renata been saying that about you? I shook my head. Saying what, specifically? That you live off David, that he's been carrying you. I looked at him. She said it to me directly tonight for the first time. Gerald's expression didn't change. She's been saying it to other people for about 3 years. The coffee was good and hot, and I set it back down carefully. 3 years. Started small, he said. Little comments. Jokes. Almost. Then it just kept going. Same story, same shape, every time I heard it. You retired early because David covered your bills. You sold the shop because it failed. David's been subsidizing your mortgage? He paused. I didn't say anything because I assumed it was private family business and David would handle it. He looked out the window at the parking lot. Then I started realizing David wasn't handling it, because David believed it too. That one landed wrong. I said, David knows how I run my finances. Gerald just looked at me, and the word knows dissolved a little in the air between us. Because the truth was, David knew what I'd told him, and I hadn't told him much. Not because I was hiding anything, because I was raised by a man who thought talking about money was something you did with your accountant and nobody else. You handled your business. You didn't narrate it. There's more, Gerald said, and he said it the way people say things they've been carrying for too long and finally need to put down. She talks about your house. What about it? Like it's going to be David's eventually. She told my wife that you'd probably deed it over to David when you can't keep it up anymore. Said it was basically already their retirement plan. I sat with that. My house is a 4-bedroom on 6 acres outside Maryville that I bought in 1987 with money I saved for 4 years before I was 25 years old. I've paid for every repair, every roof, every window, every pipe that ever froze and split in February. My name has been the only name on that deed for 36 years. I paid for David's college. I floated him a loan of $14,000 when he and Renata's first business idea collapsed in 2015, a loan he paid back, which I respected him for. I paid for their wedding rehearsal dinner, which nobody had asked me to do, and which cost more than my first truck. I covered his car insurance until he was 25, without saying a word about it. Not because I expected anything back, because that's what fathers do when they can. But somewhere in the translation, all of that had become evidence of the opposite of what it was. When a story gets repeated often enough in enough rooms, it stops being a story. It becomes the truth. And the truth is a hard thing to dislodge once it's settled. I told Gerald I needed to think. He nodded. We split the check and sat there a while longer, talking about nothing in particular, the way old friends do when the important conversation is technically over. But neither of them wants to leave just yet. On the drive home, I stopped at my shop, closed now, 3 years retired, but I still own the building and lease it to a guy named Pete, who fixes diesel engines and pays me on time without fail. I sat in the parking lot and looked at the sign Pete hadn't changed, because he said changing it would confuse the customers. Tully Fabrication and Repair. Est. 1,989. I drove home, went to the back office, opened the filing cabinet. If Renata believed my son had been quietly supporting me, I needed to know exactly what the actual numbers looked like. Not because I owed anyone an accounting, because I needed to understand how far the story had drifted from the facts. I started with David's college. 4 years, room and board included, a state school, but not cheap. $81,000 paid over 4 years without a loan. I put it in a spreadsheet. Then the wedding rehearsal dinner. $9,000 on a credit card I paid off in 2 months. Then the 2015 business loan, $14,000, repaid in full. I flagged it but didn't count it because the principal wasn't the same. Still, it was on the record. His first car, a used Tacoma, I co-signed on and ended up paying 2 years of insurance for $4,800. A medical situation in 2018, a surgery Renata needed that hit an insurance gap. I'd written a check for $7,200 without being asked. I'd never mentioned it since. Neither had she. I kept going, By 2 in the afternoon, the number was sitting at $124,000 over 20 years. Now, I want to say something directly to you, friend, because this is important. That number didn't make me angry. Numbers are numbers. I'd spent more than that keeping the shop running through a bad year. What made me quiet, the kind of quiet that's worse than anger, was the shape of what the number represented. Every one of those entries was a phone call, a crisis, a moment when I said yes without being asked twice. And somehow the sum total of $124,000 of yes had been filed under man who contributes nothing in the story his daughter-in-law was telling people at dinner parties. The math and the story were not just different, they were opposites. I made a sandwich, ate half of it, put the rest in the fridge. Around 4 o'clock, an old customer of mine named Sherry called to catch up, the way she does every few months. We talked about her grandkids, about October weather, about whether Pete was keeping the shop clean, and then she said, casual as passing the salt, I always thought it was real good of David to take care of you since you retired. You raised a good one. I set the sandwich wrapper on the counter very slowly. Sherry, tell me exactly what you heard. She backpedaled the way people do when they've accidentally stepped into something. Oh, Renata mentioned at book club that you'd really struggled after selling the shop, that David had kind of quietly stepped in, I assumed. When did she say this? Oh, Raymond, I don't know. Maybe 2 years ago? Maybe more? I thanked her and got off the phone. Book club. 2 years ago. Same story. Same shape. I walked back to the office and stared at the spreadsheet. Renata hadn't made a joke at dinner. She'd given a speech she'd been rehearsing for 2 years in other people's living rooms. Here's what I had to sit with, and it wasn't comfortable. Renata didn't invent this out of pure malice. She'd built it the way people build most beliefs, from fragments, from silence, from a narrative that went uncorrected long enough to calcify. And who had let it go uncorrected? David. My son had been in those rooms. He'd heard it. And he hadn't said, that's not right. Not once that I knew of. I'm not here to make David the villain of this. I love my son the same way I loved him when he was 4 years old and fell asleep against my shoulder in the truck. That doesn't change. But love and truth are not the same thing, and pretending they are is how small silences become large ones. David called that night around 8. His voice was careful. Dad, about last night. I know, I said. She didn't mean it the way it... David. I kept my voice even. Did you correct her? Any of the times she said it before? A long pause. I didn't think it was a big deal. I looked out the window at the dark. How long have you believed it? Another pause. Longer. I don't know, he said quietly. Maybe I just stopped thinking about it, which is different from not believing it, and we both knew that. I told him I needed a few days. He said he understood. I don't know if he did. What I did next, I want to be clear, was not revenge. It wasn't even anger. It was just clarity, the kind that comes when you finally stop tolerating the gap between what's true and what people believe. I called my attorney, a woman named Paulette, who I've used for 30 years, and who once told me that the most expensive thing a man can do is assume everyone understands his intentions. Paulette, I said, I need to review my estate documents, everything. The property, the shop building, the accounts. And I want to be sure David has written documentation of every financial arrangement we've had since 1999. She was quiet for a second. Then, do you want to explain what happened? I did. When I finished, she said, I'll have everything ready Thursday. Then she said, Raymond. The shop building alone, Pete's lease, what you're drawing on it quarterly. I know. Does David know? I thought about it honestly. I don't think he does. Another pause. Okay, she said. Thursday. I want to explain something here, friend, because I think it matters. I didn't tell David about the lease income from the shop because it never seemed relevant. I wasn't struggling. I wasn't asking for anything. When you don't need help, you don't announce your finances to prove you don't need help. That's just what a man does who was raised to handle his own business. But the silence had been used to write a story, and now the story had a public audience. And somewhere in Knoxville, Tennessee, people who had known me for 20 years were walking around with a version of Raymond Tully that had never existed. 3 days later, Renata called. She was polite the way people are polite when they know they've gone too far and want to manage the fallout without quite admitting to the thing that caused it. She said she hoped I understood it was all in good fun. She said family should be able to joke. She said I was too sensitive. I let her finish. Then I said, Renata, I need you to hear me clearly, because I'm only going to say this once. She was quiet. What you said at dinner wasn't a joke. A joke is something both people can laugh at. What you did was tell a story about me to a room full of people, the same story you've been telling for 2 years at book clubs and dinner parties and wherever else, and you said it in front of my son and his colleagues, and people I've known since before you were born. I paused. I don't need an apology for my feelings. I need you to understand that the story isn't true, and it's going to stop. A long silence. It was just everyone laughs about things like that, family stuff. Then ask David what I paid for his college. Ask him about 2018. Ask him about the rehearsal dinner. Nothing. I'm not asking you to like me, Renata. I never have been. But I will not have you standing in rooms building a fiction about who I am and what I've contributed while my son sits there and says nothing. She hung up. David called an hour later. He'd talked to Renata. She said you were hostile. I was direct. Dad. David. Did you ask her about the things I mentioned? A pause. She said she didn't know about the medical thing. She knew. I wrote a check. You thanked me. Silence. She said she didn't realize about the shop building either. That you still had income from it. I know she didn't. Why didn't you ever say something? And I had to be honest about that. Because the answer wasn't flattering. Because I was raised to believe that what you do for your family doesn't need a scorecard. That if you give help, you give it and you don't keep a ledger. I paused. What I didn't understand until this week was that in the absence of a ledger, somebody else will write one for you. David was quiet for a long time. Then he said, I'm sorry, Dad. Not, she's sorry. Not, we should talk about it. Just that. I said, I know. Now here is where I need to tell you something, friend, because the story isn't over and the part that comes next is the part I think about most. A week after that phone call, David and Renata hosted a dinner at their house. A group of their friends, some of mine, people from their neighborhood. I found out about it because Gerald called to say he'd heard about it and thought I should probably be there. Renata had framed it as a chance to clear the air. That was the polite version. I understood it for what it was. She wanted a room. She wanted an audience. She wanted to manage the narrative publicly the same way she'd spread it publicly. Controlled environment. Her ground. I thought about not going. Staying home would have been easier, and I'm 63 years old and I'm through doing hard things for easy reasons. But I went. Because there's a difference between avoiding a fight and surrendering a truth. And I have never in my life been willing to let something false stand just because correcting it was inconvenient. Their house is in a nice part of West Knoxville, big kitchen, open floor plan, the kind of house that looks like a magazine when it's clean. There were maybe 25 people there when I arrived. David met me at the door. He looked like a man who hadn't slept well in a week. She wants to say something to the group, he said quietly. I figured, you okay? I'm fine, David. Let it happen. Gerald was already there, leaning against the kitchen counter with a beer and an expression that said he'd been watching the room for an hour. For a while, it was just a dinner party. Food, conversation, the normal human machinery of a social gathering. Renata was gracious and attentive, and if you didn't know what you were watching, it looked entirely normal. Then she clinked her glass. The room quieted. I just want to say, she started, that I owe some people an explanation for last week. She looked around the room with the practiced sincerity of someone who has rehearsed the apology but not the actual regret. I made a joke that landed wrong, and I want to address that. A few polite nods. Raymond and I have had our differences over the years. She looked at me. And I think sometimes those things come out in ways that aren't fair. So I just want to say that I know Raymond worked hard his whole life. A pause for effect. And that whatever I said came from a place of family frustration, not fact. It was good. I'll give her that. It sounded like an apology without being one. It reframed the original lie as a joke, the joke as frustration, and the frustration as family complexity. Clean. Deniable. And now on the public record in the same room where the damage had started. Several people nodded. Someone said, "That's sweet." The room started to relax. And then Gerald set his beer down. He was across the room, and he did it quietly, and that small click of a glass on a counter shouldn't have been audible. But the room caught it. Gerald has always had that quality. He doesn't make noise, he creates attention. "I'd like to say something," he said. Renata blinked. "Of course." Gerald looked around the room slowly, the way a man does who is about to say something he has thought through completely and will not be rushed. "I've known Raymond Tully for 44 years, and I know some things about him that most people in this room don't know, because Raymond is not the kind of man who talks about himself." He looked directly at Renata. "What you said at the party last week wasn't a joke. I've heard that same story from 3 different people in 2 different counties over the past 2 years. That's not frustration. That's a campaign." He said it without heat, like he was reading from a document, and it isn't true. The room went very still. Renata started, "Gerald, I don't think—" "I know you don't," he said simply, and turned back to the room. Then he said the thing I hadn't expected, hadn't known was coming. "Raymond fronted money to keep 4 local families in their houses during the 2008 collapse. Didn't loan it, gave it, didn't tell anyone. I only know because one of those families told me 10 years later." He paused. "His shop employed 11 people through a stretch in 2011 when he was barely breaking even. He paid full wages and cut his own draw to nothing for 8 months, so nobody lost their health coverage." He looked at the floor, then back up. "He paid for his son's entire college education out of pocket. He covered a medical bill in this house that most people in this room would know about if Renata had ever mentioned it. He has drawn steady lease income from his building since the day he retired, and he doesn't need a single dollar from anyone at this table." Nobody moved. I was looking at my hands. "What Raymond won't say," Gerald continued, "because he was raised the same way I was, and that way is stupid sometimes, is that the version of him that's been going around is not just wrong, it's the exact opposite of true. And I've been quiet about it too long." He picked up his beer. "That's all I've got." The room held its breath for a long moment. Then David stood up. He was across the room from me. His face was not pale, it was something worse. It was the face of a man who has just understood something about himself that he won't be able to unknow. "Dad." His voice broke slightly on the second syllable. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The room understood. Renata sat very still. She didn't look furious. She looked like someone who has been mid-sentence when the lights come up, when you realize the audience has been there the whole time, listening to the full conversation, not just the version you were performing for them. There's no triumph in that moment. "I want to be clear with you, friend, because I know what you might be hoping for, and I understand why. But what I felt sitting there was not satisfaction. It was something more complicated and less cinematic. A kind of tired relief, the way you feel when a thing you've been bracing against finally arrives and turns out to hurt exactly as much as you thought it would and not one bit more." People drifted back into smaller conversations, the way they do when the main event is over and the aftermath is too private to watch. Gerald came and stood beside me and didn't say anything. That's the thing about 44 years. You don't need to. David came to me before I left. He looked like a man carrying something he didn't know how to set down. "I should have said something," he said. "Every time. From the beginning." I put my hand on his shoulder. He's 51 years old, and in that moment he looked about 16 to me, which is how your children look when they're trying to be honest with you about something that cost them. "I know," I said. That's where we start. It took time after that. Real time, not the kind that passes quickly in stories. Renata and I didn't suddenly become close. We became something more honest than close. We became people who know exactly where we stand and say so when it matters. That is worth more than warmth that sits on top of resentment. I know that now. David and I had about a dozen long conversations over the following months. Some of them were hard. The hardest one was the day he told me he'd stopped asking questions about my finances because somewhere along the way he'd decided it was easier to let Renata's version live than to push back against it at home. He wasn't proud of that. He said it plainly, and I respected him for it, and I told him I understood how that happened, even if I couldn't let it stand. Something I've thought about every day since is this. The mistake I made wasn't being generous. Generous is good. Generous is what you're supposed to be for the people you love. The mistake was believing that generosity is self-evident. That the people on the receiving end automatically understand the weight of what they're receiving and naturally translate that into something like respect. Some people do, some people don't, and the difference has nothing to do with how much you give them. What I know now, at 63, is that love without honesty is just tolerance with a better name, and tolerance isn't a gift, it's a habit. And habits, left alone long enough, start to look like furniture, like they've always been there, like they belong. The house is still mine. 6 acres, 4 bedrooms, the same kitchen where I ate breakfast alone the morning after Renata's dinner party. I'm not planning to deed it to anyone. I'm planning to live in it for as long as it makes sense, and after that, Paulette will handle whatever comes next according to documents that say exactly what I mean and nothing else. Gerald comes up from Greenville once a month, and we eat breakfast at Parker's and talk about absolutely nothing important, which turns out to be one of the finest things in a life if you're lucky enough to have it. And here's what I want to leave you with, friend, because this is the part that matters more than anything else. At some point in the last 20 years, I taught the people around me that my yes had no bottom, that asking again was always worth trying, that the automatic answer was yes, and the door was always open, and the account never ran dry. I taught them that without meaning to, one phone call at a time, one check at a time, one yes, when I maybe should have said, let me think about it. And when you teach people that, they stop seeing what it costs you. The sacrifice disappears into the habit. The habit becomes an assumption. The assumption becomes a right. And somewhere in there, the person doing the giving stops being a person and starts being a resource. Don't let yourself become a resource to the people you love. Be generous. Please be generous. The world needs more of it, not less. But let the people you love feel the weight of what you give them, not as a debt, not as leverage, just as truth. Let them understand that yes is a choice, not a given. That help has a human being behind it, not just a checkbook. Because the kindest thing I could have done for my son years before any of this happened was let him feel the full weight of what was being given, not to make him grateful, to make him real. So here's where I want to hear from you. If you think I was right to let it all come out in that room, that the truth needed a public moment to undo a public lie, comment the number 1. If you think I should have handled it privately, just between David and Renata and me, and that Gerald standing up like that only made things worse in the long run, comment 2. And if you think I should have had this out years ago, the very first time I heard a version of that story, and that I did everyone a disservice by staying quiet as long as I did, comment 3. Tell me where you're watching from, and what time it is where you are right now. I genuinely want to know how far this reaches. And tell me honestly, have you ever quietly paid for something nobody knew about, and then had to sit in a room while someone described you as the person who never contributes? If you have, then you already understand this whole story better than I could ever explain it. If any part of this sat with you, do me a favor and stay a while. I come back here and tell these stories for people like you, the ones who carry things quietly, who give without announcing it, and who are trying to figure out how to keep their dignity and their heart intact at the same time. You are not alone in that. I'll see you in the next one. This is a fictional story inspired by real emotional experiences, fully written and imagined in Knoxville, Tennessee, to create original content. Any resemblance to real persons or events is entirely coincidental. Generosity doesn't need an audience, but it does need a voice. You don't have to announce every sacrifice you make for the people you love, but you do owe them the truth of what it costs you, not as a ledger, not as leverage, just as honesty. When you let people feel the real weight of your kindness, you don't diminish the gift, you make it human. And human is the only kind that actually lasts. A small note for you. This story was created and fictionalized by AI, crafted to bring you a moment of meaningful entertainment while leaving behind something worth carrying, a quiet reminder that the truest generosity is the kind given with both an open hand and an honest heart.